Hello everyone, and welcome to One Control Port Podcast, episode 203. I'm Benjamin Yoder, here today, talking about video games, although I won't talk about the cooperative stuff much. I'm still pretty much where I left at with It Takes Two the last couple weeks. Also, Final Fantasy 15 Comrades, nothing really new there. Just kind of upgrading weapons still and things like that. I think depending on how things go in the next couple play sessions and how people are feeling, that sounds like it might fall off here soon. And then also, I went ahead and started up NieR Replicant. So this is not the cooperative thing. NieR is not a multiplayer game. But yeah, I picked up NieR Replicant pretty much on launch day. The same thing with Battle Wonderworld. I went to a Best Buy down here and went and just like grabbed it. And I've been having a good time with it. I think it's very strange because it's very much that original game. Like they pretty much kept that game intact. They gave it a new coat of paint. It's got a nicer, quote, nicer graphics. I saw some people complaining about how they changed some of the visual design. That's just kind of the nature of remakes and things like that. Things are going to change and people are going to prefer the original. I like the original Xenoblade Chronicles graphics in the Wii version, but you know, that's just how it kind of goes. I'm a little bit more mixed on the Replicant stuff. I think it looks fine though. You know, if you didn't see those games side by side, I think generally other than maybe like the facial structure of characters, you probably wouldn't really notice until you actually put the screenshots of the game side by side and like, oh, NieR Gestalt sure looks like a PS3 game, or the original one that came out sure looks like a 360 and PS3 game, where this one definitely looks like one of those games, but really cleaned up, better texture work and things like that. So they definitely did a lot with the graphics and things like that. I think what I've been really surprised by so far is just how little was changed in terms of the structure of the game, though. There's a lot of things in NieR, the original NieR, that are... I would say pretty clearly a problem in those games. Like the ridiculous number of fetch quests, a lot of times where you're kind of just like running between cities with no real, goal outside of just going to go talk to somebody. And the world is not huge. It's pretty straightforward for the most part, but it is kind of silly to like go run across the field, run back, then run back across. And the game is very aware of these things. It will sit there and be like, oh, we got to run across this field again. But it kind of reminds me of how people complain about No More Heroes when No More Heroes is like, oh, the dialogue just keeps going, and then the game itself is at some point like, will you stop talking? The gamers are going to get tired kind of thing. It feels kind of like that, where it's like, you're complaining about this thing that's happening, but also you're making the player do the thing that's that you're complaining about. So it's a little weird to like criticize it in the game while also making you do it. It's strange stuff like that I think to some people might add to the charm of it to some degree, but it does overall I think hurt the pacing of the game in some ways. And also there's like an escort mission that is like weirdly long, that probably they could have cut in half and things like that. But those are like little changes that I think they probably could have done something about without losing too much of the game's flavor. But I think that was my biggest fear coming into NieR Replicant Remake, is that they would try to improve the experience and then they would overcut, right? There's things in that game, like I remember people complaining a lot about, there's this dungeon in the desert where each room has different tasks you have to do in it, or rather different rules in the dungeon. So you have to go and like in the actual dungeon only use certain moves while you're in certain rooms, because otherwise you're going against the rules of that room, and then you get warped back to the beginning of the room. I knew quite a few people who did not like that section. I think it's like a neat novelty for that section of the game. But if like Square Enix or I think Toy Logic's the one who worked on it, but it's all a group of companies that are all, interlinked with each other with this stuff. But if they decided basically that they, that was not a undesirable part of that game, and then they decided to remove it, I probably would have been unhappy. So I'm generally more in favor of them just kind of leaving the game as is. I'm just kind of surprised they didn't really clean it up as much as I think some people were maybe, or at least maybe just as my expectation that they would do more to change the game. Really, where all the changes come from is in the combat. And I'm kind of the mind, at this point, I have not beaten it. I'm on the path to getting to ending A. I'm pretty close. I think I'm about a dungeon or dungeon and a half away, maybe. I think there's like a one more dungeon I'm very much aware of, and there's another section of the game, I can't remember if that is like a full dungeon or if it's just like a couple rooms or something. Yeah, the combat is this kind of nice mix between the original NieR, which is kind of this like more Zelda-style grounded combat where you go around and do like a typical 3-hit combo, and you largely just kind of kill enemies that way. and NieR Automata, so more of that fast-paced movement. There's also like the ability to, abuse your attacks while on the ground to get faster speed and things like that. So it's kind of a mix between the two. And I will say at the end of the day, and I always stand by the fact that like I don't really love the original NieR's combat. I prefer it over Automata's, but it's fine. Like I'm not gonna sit there and say like, oh, NieR, the combat's so great, because it wasn't. And I don't really care for NieR Automata's combat. It's just very mashy in my opinion, and very repetitive. So this game kind of falls in between. It's still kind of mashy and repetitive, specifically towards the end of the game, I'm finding, where enemies, from what I can tell when looking at footage of the original NieR game, have a lot more health, or at least a lot more resistance to physical damage. So there is a little bit of a mashy feeling that comes out of the game towards the end, but overall, I think that the combat is really well made. The big difference here between like the original NieR is that it allows you to kind of mix spells into your combo. So before, when you were like throwing lances or like using these dark shade arms, so basically they're these special magics you can use to like throw spears at people, punch them with this giant fist, or shoot these little laser beams at people. Those kind of things were largely restricted to you just using it on its own. It wasn't really something you worked into your combo flow or anything like that. You probably could work something out, but it wasn't really intended to work that way, or at least the developers didn't really make it in a way that feels intended. In this game, you can like mid-combo throw spears, throw those fists out. You can be running around, throw the spears, things like that. So they really did a great job of intermingling the magic and combat of this game, from as far as I can tell so far. And I think that the combat itself definitely feels a lot more flashy and Automata style, but it doesn't necessarily get to the point where you're like juggling enemies around and things like that. It is still very much, here's a pretty straightforward combo that you're doing mixed with like heavy attacks. And it's very grounded combat. You can like pop enemies up a little bit, but not like a lot or anything like that. So I generally think this game has the best combat out of all three of these releases. The big thing is that I just don't think the combat is amazing this time around either, but I think it does a better job of mixing the combat, the melee and the magic at the very least, between the two. So in saying that though, one thing I am having trouble with this game is, and I kind of expected I would have trouble with this, but I wasn't quite sure how, why, or if it would be something that's a problem with me, or if it's a problem with the game. And that is the choice of keeping only the original Japanese main character. So if you don't know, with the original NieR, when that came out, they basically had this brother-sister story. It's a little brother trying to help out his sick sister. And that is the traditional story of NieR, like the original story that they made. And then based off basically what I've read before is the Western marketing at Square Enix was like, hey guys, in the West, what would be better is if we had like a bulky warrior or whatever that's going to sell better in the West. And it sounds like Yoko Taro and that team was not particularly happy about that choice, but after a bit of a negotiation, they basically decided to make two versions of the game. One that came out on PS3 that had the boy as the young character, and then one that came out on the 360 that had the adult as the main character. So you have this like, probably like 13-year-old boy in the initial game, versus like this 40-year-old dude in the Japanese version. So, and when NieR originally came out here in the West, even on the PS3, they still used the 40-year-old dude. They did not bring the kid over at all. So it's kind of exciting in this release to get the brother NieR, because we haven't had him before. There's definitely been mods out there and things like that, but there hasn't been a official release of that stuff. And so we get to see like kind of this different perspective. And when it comes to the dialogue, from what I could tell, all the content is the same for the most part. There's some slight changes here and there because obviously the context of the relationship is a bit different. But for the most part, all these interactions, all these things happening are exactly the same for the most part. So, and I think this is true for a lot of NieR fans. There's a lot of love for the older NieR in the Western release, and even though I think most people were very aware that there wasn't that he was not the original choice of the developers, I think people really came to love that character for a lot of reasons. I think a lot of it's like novelty. It was before the dad wave in games, I feel like, or at least it was the early start of the dad wave with like The Last of Us and God of War and things like that. So it's a bit more novel, and then also the fact that I don't really know anything about Japanese culture specifically outside of just like what you consume from media and things like that. But I think generally main characters in Japanese games tend to be younger characters. That's not 100% true, obviously, but typically you have, somewhere between a kid who's 13 and all the way up to maybe like 21. And if somebody's 25, they're like the grizzled veteran of the group in some ways. And that's, again, not always true. I'm sure you could pick out examples that are separate if you really sat down and thought about it. But in the case of like the mainstream context of what Japanese games were, especially in 2010 when people were like, it was 100% at the time when people were like, oh, angsty teen Japanese role-playing protagonists. I'm so tired of them kind of thing. Whether that was real or not, it's a whole other thing. But that was the perception at the time. And I think there's a lot of love for this very novel main character in a Japanese action RPG. So it's a little hard for me to say if my love for him is because of that time kind of thing. But I was trying to really keep an open mind with the brother, and still am trying to keep an open mind. But last night I sat down and really started comparing the dialogue between the two characters, between the one from 2010 and the more recent localization, and I'm finding that the older NieR, I think, is a better character for the group dynamics of that game. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that he's an older character and that he's kind of on equal footing with characters like Kaine and Vice, who are, these kind of, they're kind of jerks. Like, everybody in this world is kind of a jerk for the most part. And not everybody, but there are a lot of jerks in this world, and Kaine and Vice are very much jerks, but they're very playful jerks in a lot of ways. And that's kind of what I really liked about the original NieR, is like this very crude world that is also has a lot of touching story. Like it's very kind of sappy in the way of with a lot of Japanese games of like, hey, friendships will overcome everything, but at the same time you have Kaine over there talking about ripping people's eyes out and like pissing in their eye hole sockets, and it's like, all right, like that kind of balance was really interesting in that original game. And with the adult NieR, I think he was able to play off of those characters a lot better because he was a grown man. He had the ability to, be a part of those conversations a bit more and be a bit more aggressive in his responses, versus the brother NieR, who, being a kid, is just kind of a kid. And in a lot of ways, it makes him feel like he's kind of inferior to the rest of the group. And in some ways, it feels like Vice is kind of guiding him to some degree, more so than being a partner. And then like there's some dialogue that in the original release, like the original US release, I should say, like NieR would say something that was kind of like a funny joke, but in this release specifically, it's like Vice is saying it instead. But it's like recontextualized through NieR to say something. So there's things that I think were better distributed out throughout the group dynamics there. And I'm just not feeling that in this game. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, if you go back and look at the dialogue, 99.9% of that stuff is going to be the same. It's the little touches with the main character NieR that I think really kind of push that game over the edge there a little bit. So it's a little hard to put into words, and I think I might, because I know I talked a little bit before about doing a NieR video to some degree, specifically about kind of why I prefer the original NieR over Automata. And like, Automata came out 5 years ago at this point. Like, I honestly, and I don't really enjoy talking about Automata very much because have very negative opinions of that game, and I just feel like I'm just kind of rambling into a hole all the time about that, which is fine. Like, you don't need to listen to me. It's been 5 years. I've yelled about Automata enough. And if you like Automata, I'm not saying that you shouldn't like it. Enjoy yourself. Enjoy the video games you like, right? And I just kind of feel like dredging that back up is just kind of like useless at this point. So instead, I might kind of recontextualize a video to maybe do something similar to like the Disaster Day of Crisis video, where I take some of the dialogue between these characters and kind of put them up side by side and talk about kind of the nuances of what's being said and how the characters say it and why that kind of changes the context of how this character exists in this world. Because I think that group dynamic is a really important part of the original NieR for me, and this game is kind of missing it. So that was a lot of talking about NieR. I'm sorry. It's been on my mind this whole weekend. I played a lot of NieR this weekend, so whew. Woof, woof, woof. Hey, you want to get into the news this week? Hey, news. Basically, there's a new Tales trailer for Tales of Arise. I don't really have a lot of thoughts about how that game looks. It's a nice looking game. It's very flashy and everything. But it very much looks like a Tales game. Or at least it reminds me of how I felt about like Tales of Zestiria when that was announced, where it's like, this looks like the next level of Tales game. But I probably will never get to it. like I'm sure it's a great game. It's fine if I'd enjoy it if I played it, but I don't think I'll get around to it. But they did announce that it's going to have a release date of 9/9/2021, at least in Japan. I didn't check to see if that was international or not. I think Tales games are international at this point. I've only ever played Tales of the Tempest and Tales of Symphonia, so I'm not a Tales person really. But less because I have anything against it, and more because I just have other JRPGs I'd rather play, kind of thing. But it's a nice looking game. There's also some Scarlet Nexus gameplay that got put up on Bandai Namco's Twitter. I haven't really looked a ton at like direct gameplay in Scarlet Nexus. I've seen some of the gameplay trailers where they mix in footage and things like that, but seeing some just like raw gameplay of a character running around a dungeon and fighting, that was kind of interesting. It's really, this game whole thing seems to be like the gravity system in that game, where basically a character can defy gravity and like throw objects around using their energy and things like that. It reminds me a lot of Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, the Crystal Bearers in that regard, but with the combat system, which is something that Crystal Bearers really didn't have. Like in Crystal Bearers, you had the ability to like grab things and throw them around, and that was kind of how you fought enemies. But because you were limited in your ability to really attack things, it kind of made for some awkward encounters, especially if you didn't know how to kind of utilize the environment to fight enemies in that game. So you just kind of sit there and throw stuff around until eventually it dies. If I recall correctly, the strategy in Crystal Bearers was just like, hey, grab an enemy and just flip them over again and again. So you're just like sitting there flipping them side to side to side until they die, and it was kind of boring in execution, but the game wasn't really expecting you to do that per se, I don't think. So it was always that challenge of understanding enough of the environment and what was in the environment to really utilize that combat system. This game seems a lot more directed in its gravity mechanics. Basically, it seems like, at least in the video they showed, the characters are very keen to point out to you, like, oh, there's a chandelier up here, you should pull that down. And you go, and then you like go and smack the enemies, and then they say, okay, let's finish them off now. So maybe that's only like an early dungeon in the game that they do that. But I'm going to guess that there's probably going to be very scripted items in the environment that you can do things with, rather than just like this kind of free-form gravity system you can kind of mess around with. But honestly, I think those restrictions and railings could be very good for that type of game, and depending on like how they utilize those. If it's just every room starts with you pulling down the chandelier and throwing stuff at people, and then you go in and just clean up with melee attacks, I think that's probably going to be fairly boring overall. But mechanically, it looks really interesting, and gameplay-wise, like when you look at it from a cinematic perspective during gameplay, I think it's a really neat-looking game as well. I'm not sure when that comes out, actually. I'd have to double-check, but I think it's coming out soonish, if I recall correctly, although it feels like it's been, like, kind of, like, coming out soon for a while now. So, yeah. PSO2 New Genesis has a June 2021 release date, although it did not say the specific day for that. What was kind of interesting about this, and this is something that's been ongoing, but is kind of interesting to see this continue to be reflected, is there's like a Japanese stream for the game, and they announced, I think, like starter packs or something. And in that starter pack thing, they showed off all the consoles that PSO2 is on, and it did not include Xbox in Japan. They're still just like, nope, no Xbox in Japan. But when you go to the US, it's Xbox and PC only. So it's just like this weird kind of distinct like separation between the two different regions, and how like, I don't know if the Xbox version is even available in Japan. I would be kind of curious to see if that will ever launch on that platform in Japan, or if we're just going to end up with this weird separation for as long as time goes on. Obviously, you can, available in PC in both in regions. So if you want to do that, you can play there. I'll be curious to see if Microsoft just holds the PSO2, indefinitely. I'm going to guess they're paying some amount of money to keep that on their platform. And I'll be curious to see if it ever comes to PS4. I remember when it was first announced, Phil Spencer was kind of wishy-washy on whether it'd come on PS4 or not. I think he more or less said it was up to Sega, but I'd imagine that they've got, partnerships and contracts and things like that they got going on in the background for that reason. I think Yakuza 7 was also kind of billed as like an Xbox first game here in the US as well, despite I think the Xbox version kind of getting if I recall correctly, a underwhelming port in Japan. Like, I think specifically had something to do with the languages in the Xbox version in Japan. Like, it didn't really particularly handle Japanese well, if I recall correctly. I'm saying this all out of some distant space in my mind, so don't like repeat that without doing actual research on that, because I'm literally just throwing out some garbage. My brain is like, isn't there something of the other happens with that version of the game, I think. So yeah. One thing that's kind of been neat coming up here with Nintendo is that they have Pokemon Snap coming out. I don't believe it's out yet. Pretty sure it's coming out sometime soon. But maybe somewhat expectedly, they're trying to kind of bring back the printing feature of Pokemon Snap. So if you didn't see, or if you weren't aware at the time, with Pokemon Snap on the Nintendo 64, you could basically save pictures of the Pokemon you took. And I think you have to bring your cartridge in. I don't think it was like a memory pack thing. I think you brought your entire Pokemon Snap cartridge in to like a Blockbuster video. And if you put your cartridge in the machine, you could basically print out little pictures that you took in the game to take with you. So with the release of Pokemon Snap in Japan, they have the ability to print pictures from your game from Lawson's. I'm not sure how that interaction happens, if you're bringing your console there, if you're logging into an account or something along those lines. But that's kind of a fun thing. But in addition to this, they're also partnering with like this little portable printer that you can also use with your Switch. Or it's kind of weird. It's one of those things where it's like, yeah, you can take pictures from your Switch, upload them to your phone, and then use your phone to interact with the printer to go ahead and print out pictures that way. But it is not limited to Pokemon Snap. It looks like it's pretty much, I don't know if they actually limit it down per game, honestly. It might be something that it's like just any picture on the Switch, but the ones they showed were like Animal Crossing, I believe. Pokemon Snap was another one, and I'm missing one more, but they had one other game they showed it with as well. And so you could actually use this little portable printer to print out pictures from the game too. I'm always kind of interested by the fact that these integrations that Nintendo's doing with a variety of like kind of outside applications from Nintendo is through usually a mobile app. And I wonder if that is to kind of like protect the integrity of the Switch's software. Basically, don't put situations where the Switch is communicating with this printer directly, right? So maybe it opens up less vulnerabilities to them. But I don't know. To some degree, I feel like connecting to a smartphone specifically might be even more worse. Although if you're just sending data to the smartphone rather than sending anything back to the Switch, that means you're basically able to just send data one way instead. But yeah, I guess you could do that with the printer too. I don't know. Don't listen to me. It's very interesting that Nintendo has like the smartphone middle piece to like a lot of things, like their voice chat applications and things like that. And I'm kind of curious what the thought is behind that. Obviously, most people have smartphones these days, or at least most people in like an audience that is buying the Nintendo Switch probably. So I don't really think there's a lot of need for there to be some other solution that's like a direct solution, but it is this kind of like weird extra step they make you get involved in. There's actually like a Final Fantasy 14 photo book thing out there now that you can do too, where basically I think you can just take your screenshots that you took while playing Final Fantasy 14 and basically get them printed in a book through Square Enix. I think it's like $50 for a book, so it's not particularly cheap. But that's like a cool, fun thing. I mean, like with MMOs, at least when I was playing MMOs, I imagine it's still the same today. They're like, to some degree, people like live in those games, right? And that is like a big part of their lives. So like the memories they develop across an MMO can be like really special things. So being able to like create a photo album from that is, I think, a really fun thing. Obviously, to some other people, that probably would look like a really silly, goofy thing, and it probably is kind of a waste of money if you could just pull the screenshots on your own. But it's a fun little thing, right? It's a nice way to kind of cement those memories in a way. And have like something you just put on like a coffee table, and maybe your Final Fantasy 14 friends who you meet at some point can come over and be like, oh yeah, let me flip through this. Meanwhile, your grandma will be like, why do you have video game screenshots on your coffee table? So yeah, I think it's like a fun little thing though. There's also a couple mobile games getting shut down. The Sakura Wars mobile game, I haven't really talked too much about that. I don't really play mobile games, but I do try to like keep an eye on what's coming up and what comes out, especially for the bigger publishers like Sega, Square Enix, and things like that. And Sakura Wars is an IP, especially one they try to reboot recently. So that game's being shut down. I don't think it's been alive for more than a year, so it's a pretty quick turnaround time. But I think what's more interesting to me probably, and I need to go back and check the sales numbers for Shin Sakura Wars, the PS4 game, which is called Sakura Wars in the US, I believe. I'm curious if that was successful or not. There was a really big marketing push for that. I remember when I was in Japan, Like when I was in Akihabara, it was just that theme was playing nonstop. That song. And there were advertisements everywhere, and I remember seeing ads on TV as well. I'm kind of curious if that game would be considered a success at Sega these days. I get the feeling that maybe it wasn't, but I feel like a lot of Sega games, I'm just like, they come out and I feel like, I'm like, did that sell well? And usually the answer is, it sold okay. Valkyria Chronicles it was a similar situation. So yeah, I'm kind of curious how this did. There's also the Star Ocean. I'm gonna mess up this pronunciation. Amanesis, the Star Ocean mobile game, which, as far as I'm aware, is the last like Star Ocean game that came out since Star Ocean 5 came out, like early PS4 era, if I recall correctly. So that is dead. I'm kind of curious if Square Enix will continue to make games in the Star Ocean series. If any company will, I think it's Square Enix. Like, I mean, obviously they own the IP, so they'd be like the company that would. But I mean, like that type of game, right? Like that mid, like I would say almost C-tier JRPG franchise. Like Square Enix tends to have a weird commitment to that stuff at times. Like with NieR, like I'm surprised Drakengard 3 exists. I'm surprised NieR Automata even exists. Like I think those games did fine. But I don't know. They just like kept making them. I'm glad they did. But it's like weird things like that. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see another Star Ocean game someday. But I am kind of curious now that the mobile game shut down, like what that team is doing, if they're actually working on a project or if they're being like distributed out through Square Enix to work on other things. So yeah. And then last story here is that the Vita and PS3 stores are going to be staying online. Basically, Sony backed off on their shutting down of those services and said, "Hey, we're going to keep the PS3 and Vita online as long as." Well, they didn't say a date. We don't know how long it's going to be, but they said they were not going to be shutting down. The PSP store, they are shutting down though. I think a lot of people have already commented about this, really, and I'm kind of the mind that I think everybody's happy that they're like, okay, we're not going to shut these down, or at least two out of three of them. This is better than all three of them shutting down, right? But I really wonder. I don't know. It's one of those things that like so much attention came to how digital copywriting works and things like that, and like licensing specifically, and like how your PlayStation 4 is going to be affected by the lack of servers, when the CMOS battery dies in the system, things like that. It brought to light a lot of things for the mainstream. And obviously there are people in the world who have known this for some time, or at least have known the general concept of what was going to happen, maybe not have like actual proof, right? That was kind of the big thing, is that somebody actually went and like started doing this stuff with their consoles. So I'm happy that we have more of a spotlight on that. In some ways, this is kind of maybe one of the better case scenarios for the public as a whole, that we get to keep two of these storefronts. Obviously the PSP shutting down is something people need to work on, but that at least narrows it down to one for now, so people can make sure everything's backed up from those stores. In the meantime, I might go download the Hunex Clock app. I haven't done that yet. I maybe should. I don't know. I don't remember much about buying region-locked PSP games, or not region-locked, but like PSP games from different regions, and what would be needed for that. I assume it's the same currency you use today. It's not like the Wii, where like there's a separate points card for the Nintendo Wii versus the Wii U and things like that. So I don't think it will probably be that hard to do that if I really wanted to. I'd imagine it's also a pretty cheap thing as well, but a dumb little thing, have a little clock on your PSP. It has like a bunch of, I guess, voice actors and idols or something like that are on there telling you the time, basically. It's a silly little thing that you might expect from a company like that. But yeah, I'm kind of, I'm kind of waiting to see if people still demand answers about licensing. I'm going to guess not. It seems like this conversation is starting to dissipate after what Sony has said, which is probably the intended reaction to dissipate that conversation. But people in general seem to be having a lot of trouble with a lot of Sony's decisions recently. So it'll be interesting to see if this is the start of Sony kind of being like, actually, we need to kind of like calm down on some of this messaging that we're doing, and make something that seems more pro-consumer rather than just like, I gotta shut it all down. Or if we'll just, this is an exception and we'll just continue to see, Sony making kind of, I call them bullish moves. I don't know if that's the right word or not, but and this is not Sony specifically. Like anytime somebody gets in first place, they can basically start doing whatever they want because they have the power in the industry. So you end up with, Nintendo not localizing a lot of Wii games because why would you bother to sell 30,000 copies of Disaster Day of Crisis when you could sell, however million copies of whatever recent Wii game, came out? It'd be more value to put your money to advertising of some other game that you're selling rather than, investing money in this game that's going to barely make a profit, if anything, if at all. But that's just kind of how it goes. So, 10 years from now, we'll see who's the one that's going to be making people all flustered about video games. But today it's Sony. Maybe 5 years from now it'll be Nintendo. Maybe 5 years after that it'll be Microsoft again. It just kind of comes in waves, right? So yeah. Anyways, that's it for this week's podcast. Thanks for coming. OneControlPort.com is the website. Like I mentioned earlier, for the NieR video, I'm still kind of figuring out what it will be. But, once I finish up at least ending A of NieR, I think I'll take some time to think about what kind of video I want to make for that. I'm leaning towards that kind of brother NieR / Papa NieR comparison video because I think that probably makes sense, given what I'm thinking about the game right now and things like that. And then also after that, I plan on kind of shifting over to doing some PCFX stuff. So once NieR is done, that is my next focus, is getting to PCFX stuff. I actually got the PCFX mouse back, so I'm able to do that. So should be good to go on that. And then also I'm going to try to play through a couple games and also revisit certain games and kind of get some ideas about like how you could approach them a bit differently than I did, to hopefully better improve the experience of playing it as somebody who doesn't speak any Japanese or anything like that, or understand any Japanese really. So I'm planning on doing that. If you didn't see it last week, the Megasudo 2096 video went up where I basically talk about the PlayStation 2 backwards compatibility issues with that game using my specific PS2, the 77,000 PS2. That I have a pink one from Japan, which is why the thumbnail icon is pink. So that video is out there if you want to go look at that. It's pretty put it together in like maybe about 24 to 48 hours, so it came together pretty quickly, but that was about how the other backwards compatibility video was. There's definitely things with the script that I think kind of suffer a little bit, but that's kind of the nature of working on a faster timeline like that. So in some ways, it's like I would rather spend all the time in the world editing the script so I can make it better. But at the same time, I think that also leads to situations where we go like 2 months without a video because I'm so caught up on this specific part of the script that I cannot figure out how to fix. And I just keep putting it off, revisiting it, reworking it, and then being like, it's still not fixed, and keep doing that. That's how Valkyria Revolution takes 6 months to get done, even though you already have a foundation to work off of. So yeah. And so that's probably gonna be the next focus. In terms of stream stuff, we finished up Quest 64 this week. We actually had a fun little thing where we had like a community review. I'm not sure like how people felt about it, so let me know. It seemed like the people who are on stream at least enjoyed the idea. I might try to see if there's a way we can kind of compile those in a more public space so you can see what those reviews ended up being. I'm not sure if that's just going to be like a listing on the website or if it's going to be like maybe I'll edit down the video to be something that goes up on the YouTube, although it's kind of like a stream clip kind of thing. I'm not sure what to do with clips really. Like sometimes I think about clipping out a podcast or clipping out YouTube video, like a specific chunk of it, or stream or something like that, and it just takes a lot of time and figuring out what's a good clip and how to distribute that. I don't really want to flood my YouTube channel with a bunch of clips for the podcast, right? So yeah, I don't know how to feel about that. We'll see maybe in the future, but otherwise that's pretty much it. Anyways, thanks for coming. OneControlPort.com is the website, and we'll be streaming some Odama this week for the GameCube using the microphone. So hopefully that goes well. If we do not stream Odama, or if Odama does not go well on stream, we will switch to something else. So yeah. But otherwise, I hope you have a great week. Bye.